Today's film is all about the inner critic. What is the inner critic? Where does it come from? And what can we do about it? Now, some of you are not going to need much of an introduction to your inner critic. I'm sure some of you will be very well aware of the messages that your inner critic has given you over your lifetime. Some of you may not be so familiar. So for those that aren't, it's that voice inside your mind that really goes to town on all your biggest fears and anxieties and really does a number on you. It's that voice that tells you you're simply not good enough. Sound familiar? So this voice, it varies in intensity and in frequency from person to person, but also within yourselves, depending on what levels of stress that you're dealing with at any given time. So the voice is going to be more prevalent, actually, the more stresses and anxieties that you're experiencing. So in a pandemic, for example, you may find that your inner critic can really take hold. So there'll be some of you that will be beating yourselves up while you've been in lockdown for not having learnt to speak Japanese, cook food from scratch and provide beautiful meals for everyone in the family every day, for not homeschooling your children to becoming geniuses in 6 weeks. I'm sure some of you will be giving yourself a hard time about that. Well, that will be your inner critic. Actually, all you need to do is just survive, and that's enough. But you know, our inner critic doesn't really listen to that sort of more balanced point of view. It is very black and white. There is no grey. So some of the messages that we can hear, if we're stressed at work, it might be telling us that you're not good enough, that soon someone will find out, that you might end up getting the sack. You might find that your inner critic is more likely to pop up in your relationships. Maybe you have less confidence there, and so that voice will tell you that no one likes you, that you're a horrible person. How could anyone like you? So it plays on our self-esteem, and it plays on our confidence. It undermines the decisions that we make, and even stops us from enjoying the accomplishments that we have in our lives, because we'll stop even seeing ourselves as worthy of having them, or that they happen because of some fluke, or that they weren't even genuine at all. So this inner critic, it's not based on anything real. It's not objective. It's punitive, and it degrades us. And if we don't check that voice, it can start to prevent us from enjoying any part of our life, actually, because it starts to influence how we think in everyday situations, and that can then influence how we feel, and then how we feel starts to influence how we behave. So, for example, if you've got enough stress at work and that's starting to feel overwhelming, then maybe you start procrastinating, avoiding doing certain jobs that you know you've got to do, putting them off, finding ways to avoid doing them. Maybe you avoid going to work at all, or maybe you avoid a particular person because you're feeling so overwhelmingly awful. So you might find yourself ringing up work and telling them that you're sick, that you can't come in, because of your levels of anxiety and your inner critic giving you a bunch of grief. Or maybe you find yourselves trying to find other ways of making yourself feel better. So, and in those situations, we tend to go for the quick fix, the thing that makes us feel better. So, the sort of sweet or sugary, salty, fatty foods that, make us feel temporarily better. We might reach for those, or maybe we might grab, the alcohol, and maybe one glass leads to another glass, leads to more glasses, and then before you know it, we've created habits that make us feel good because we're trying to battle with our inner critic. I don't know if any of that sounds familiar or rings true to you. Often our inner critic begins when we're in childhood. So, maybe a significant carer or a parent or some other adult in our life that has meaning to us will let us know in their own way that we haven't quite met the mark, and so we need to change to do it better. The trouble is, it often has the reverse effect, and rather than making us feel inspired to become a better version of ourselves, it just leaves us feeling really quite awful and shamed or guilty. And when we're children, our prefrontal cortex is not well developed. It's not actually developed until we're 25. So we don't have the capacity to challenge this idea that we're not good. So we start to identify in some negative way with our inner critic. We start to identify ourselves as being unlovable, or we start to identify with ourselves as being not good enough or not clever enough. And that idea sticks. And then throughout our lives, when we're in situations where that idea of ourselves pops up, then our inner critic pops up too. And so it starts to have more and more leverage throughout our lives. Why? Well, it all goes back to primitive man. So primitive man was all about survival. It didn't have the prefrontal cortex that we have nowadays. It just had the original primitive brain, and that original primitive brain was all about survival. So it was either good for survival or it was either bad for survival. Now, if you were a primitive man and you came across a bear and you went, oh wow, look at that lovely bear, and you went up and stroked it to see how soft it was, well, you would have ended up being eaten. So we are here because our ancestors were the ones that were afraid. They needed to be afraid in order to survive. So it's in our DNA. We're primed to notice the negative. We are primed to be afraid of certain situations. And so that's why our inner critic has been able to take hold. We become wary. We anticipate negative. And our inner critic, only goes to uphold those ideas within us. So, how do we step back from this inner critic? Well, there are a number of ways. First of all, you need to notice that your inner critic is taking hold. Notice what you're thinking about yourself. You may be so used to thinking negative things about yourself that it's just become normal. So actually step back from your thoughts and think about, what am I thinking here? Is it negative or is it positive? Once you've noticed what you're thinking, then don't necessarily give that thought as much significance as you do. Don't ruminate. So when I say that, what I mean is don't, oh, I mustn't think that, because the more you focus on what you shouldn't be thinking about, you end up thinking about it even more, if that makes sense. So instead of sitting there thinking about, oh, I should have done this better, I should have done that better, I was really terrible, why did I say that, oh, and in the future I'll never get it right, I was awful, ripping yourself to bits. Don't do that. Just go off and distract yourself. Distraction is the key, because if you've noticed you've thought something, you've noticed that it's negative, but you're not giving it any power, you then go off and do something else, distract yourself from the thought, then that thought automatically has less power in your mind. So distraction is definitely the key. Play the scenario over in your head. So if you've been to an interview and you didn't do as well as you'd hoped, and maybe things didn't quite go to plan, ask yourself, what would your best friend say to you? And really take that on board, because we are our worst critics. So imagine you're not you, and imagine that was your friend in that situation. What would you be saying to them? And listen to that advice, because the chances are it'll be a lot kinder than what you might be saying to yourself. Challenge the evidence in front of you. So when that voice says, you're a failure, you're always doing this or you're always doing that, you know that you're catastrophizing. So give yourself an opportunity to challenge. Look at the evidence. Have you always failed? Because the chances are you haven't. There'll be lots of times when actually you've been really, really successful, but you've just forgotten it in that moment. So write down the pros and the cons of everything you've done and look at all of the times you've succeeded and give yourself an opportunity to challenge yourself. That way it'll help yourself to be much more realistic about what your voice is telling you inside your mind. And ask yourself, what's the worst that can happen? Because often we tend to go to the worst case scenario. Oh, I can't possibly do that, I'm going to fail. So if you do fail, what's the worst that can happen? The chances are it might even be better than you imagine, because we tend to worry about these worst case scenarios. And if something's gone a little bit wrong and you haven't quite succeeded the way you wanted to, what do you need to do better? So instead of focusing on the thing that's gone wrong, take it as an opportunity to fine-tune, to tweak, to think about, well, actually what I could do is this, or what I could do is that. Because in finding solutions, that automatically takes us away from that negative part of our brain and takes us into the helpful, solution-focused part of our brain. And in that way, we don't beat ourselves up. We don't give ourselves a hard time. We don't tell ourselves that we're always a disaster. We can let it go, and we can look at ways in which we can improve ourselves. People that are successful are people that actually got into that habit. I think it was it Dyson who said, you know, have you always been a success? And he said, well, I don't think of myself as a success. And someone said, well, you know, you've invented this best-selling Hoover. And he said, yes, but if you knew how many Hoovers I had to invent before I arrived at the end result, you know, that's why I don't think of myself as being successful. But the point is that he didn't give up. He didn't give in to his inner critic. He just kept going until he found a better way of doing it. He used it as an opportunity to move himself forward, but without giving himself a hard time. So there are a few ways in which you can challenge that inner critic and step back. So be kind to yourself and work with it and not against it. So if this has been helpful to you, please do give me a like, do subscribe to my channel.